Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another EPPAC meeting. Thanks for joining. I wanted to quickly go over the agenda for today because we have been bouncing around a little bit over the last few meetings. Our previous meeting, we had taken a break briefly from doing some of the scenario assumptions development as the JU did some kind of data and assumptions building in the background based on our feedback from the December meeting. And last week last meeting, we had gone through the headroom analysis and the development of those numbers and how the headroom within the utility territories for interconnection makes its way into the capacity expansion analysis as a constraint for where and when to build, say, renewables and storage. In between these past few meetings, there's been a number of questions on that from the different stakeholders in this group. So we are now thinking about potentially having a broader discussion as part of a later EPPAC meeting, but we'd also encourage the JU folks to kind of get together and maybe come up with some of those answers that we to some of the questions that have come up in the meantime. So we'll coordinate offline on that, but just wanted to raise that, we will probably be having more discussion on some of the kind of model development details in future EPPAC meetings. In this EPPAC meeting, we're going to be going through the scenario assumptions for scenario 2 and 3 again, in the hopes that we can get at least close enough, if not complete today, close enough to where we can work behind the scenes and get those assumptions wrapped up so the scenario matrix for scenario 2 and 3 can be handed off to the NISO by the end of January. So that's the target for today. That's what we're going to use most of the meeting for today. But before we jump into that, I did want to say thanks to everybody who responded to the email about continuing the meeting series. It was actually unanimous support for continuing the series at this time on every other Monday, 2 to 4 p.m. So we will be extending that probably out till March or April timeframe. So look out for those meeting requests. They'll also be posted to the EPPAC website and the Matter as they have been, the meeting notices. But that time did win the day, so we'll be continuing this meeting series and filling in the agendas as needed, potentially with additional model development discussions, preliminary results discussions, as well as a discussion of the siting methodology, which, as you'll remember, is pretty important in this, where we go from a zonal capacity expansion model to the local nodal models. There's a lot of work that goes into that, and we'll be having 1 or 2 EPPAC meetings over the next few months to discuss that. So before we jump in, are there any other questions or clarifications from any of the EPPAC members? Okay. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand it over to the utilities to take up the discussion of where we left off on the scenario 2 and 3 development. Jeff, I don't see Tom on the call. Who's going to be leading the discussion today from the JU?
This is Nick Colbert. I was under the impression that Tom was going to be leading the charge.
Hey, folks. Apologies. This is Tom Vaccaro. I just had a little bit of an issue getting in the WebEx, so I'm on audio, and bear with me for a minute while I try and get video so I can share my screen. But in a minute or two, yes, I'll be ready to go through our final forecasts, our final scenario details.
And apologies if it was anything I did. This is my first time running the WebEx tech as well. We usually have our hero of the day, Jalila Isi, running things in the background. I had to do it myself today, and I may have done something that kept Tom out.
No, I'd love to blame you, but it's my ignorance of how to use the technology. Should be able to share my screen in just a moment. We want to kick it off with this piece about our scenarios and finalizing the scenarios.
Yes, that'd be great. We had gone over, I think we have had 2 meetings, one at the end of November and one at the beginning of December, walking through the proposals and narrowing down on what scenario 2 and 3 would be. we landed on kind of having a low transmission need scenario and a high transmission need scenario with bundling those themes. Some of the key questions that had arisen out of those scenarios were, for the low scenario, how do you cite DERs? What's the, quantity of build out that is appropriate for a quote unquote high DER? What is appropriate quote unquote low, load? And then for the high transmission impact, how do we actually do this DEFR modeling? How do we, build in something other than combustion? How do we make sure there's potentially a higher transmission impact in that type of a world? So we just, trying to go through those and nail down those last questions.
Excellent. And I think I can see that this is sharing the right screen, but can I just get confirmation?
Yep, looks
Folks,
good right on the scenario overview tab. Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you, Skylar, for recapping, and apologies, folks, for the delays here, but I'll jump right into it. Some of the, and again, I'll focus on those items that Skylar just mentioned, knowing that we went through this in a lot more detail in previous meetings. But as we talked about, a lot of the challenges were around the low transmission impact, and then thinking about DEFRs, particularly in the high transmission impact. At a high level, some of the things that have changed since we last talked are mostly around the low transmission impact scenario 2, particularly in the DG and load forecasts that we use, because those were both challenged, rightfully so. I had some good challenges on that, and I think the selections that we've made mitigate those challenges that were brought up. I'll also mention in the higher scenario, we moved towards consideration of fuel cells to mitigate some of those concerns. We'll circle back around that to talk about it in more detail at the end. But with that, I'll jump right into these forecasts that I'm sure you're interested in. I'll start with the DER forecast. So what we did with the help of Skylar and some folks at NYSERDA who had some of these resources was we got some other options for a DG roadmap or a DG forecast or input that we can use for this scenario, I should say. And specifically, we looked for ones that would set apart from the other scenarios. We had some good challenges that stated that, hey, these all look very similar. The point is to differentiate. So I think this graph, please.
Tom, just a quick question for you, Bill Acker here. Are you going to be sharing this? I'm just wondering how much I should frankly be taking notes here. Can you share this after the meeting?
You don't have to do a ton of screenshotting. Yeah, I can send this to Skylar after the meeting, and Skylar, you can share it in whatever format you feel is appropriate.
Yep. We've been sharing the kind of like in work, work papers in terms of spreadsheets and stuff. We've been sending that by email until they're at a slightly later phase, and then we're going to be uploading those to the EPPAC website for other folks. But yes, we'll try to share them in the coming days. Sorry.
Great. Thank you very much.
No worries. Yeah, hopefully you don't have to take frantic notes. So this scenario is the one that we landed on is a place to start for incorporation based on the feedback that we got, which was specifically that we don't have something that really shows a high DER penetration, which is an important, a very real possibility in the future, an important one in terms of differentiating results. So this brown line up here comes from the solar roadmap, what they call the base case. They had a couple different scenarios. It's got some basis in potential analysis that looked at what is possible for DG on the solar side. And I should say, when we say DG, distributed generation, we're talking about retail level generation. So 5 megawatts and less, generally things that aren't generally participating directly in wholesale markets and are likely going to be distribution connected or at least sub-transmission connected, but probably not connected to the bulk transmission, for example. The solar roadmap gave levels that far exceeded the other scenarios, in particular in the years that we're interested in, the 2030, 2035, 2040. It does a good job of going above and beyond the state scenario by a substantial percentage. You could see 12 gigawatts to 17 gigawatts in 2040 under these two different cases. I will admit that these 2045 and 2050 numbers are a little massive. 26 gigawatts of solar, I'm not even sure we'd be able to host or site without some changes, given 2050 is a little ways out. So I will caveat that maybe these 2045 and 2050 numbers might have to be curtailed a little bit, depending on how things go when we start to integrate these into the capacity expansion capacity expansion models with the NISO. But these years we definitely plan on utilizing, and even if we modify these years, they'll still be much larger than what's in the state scenario, just maybe not triple or double like they are now. But I wanted to present these numbers, give that caveat, and I'll pause now for questions or thoughts, particularly for folks who had some good challenges around this last time we talked about it, if this seems to meet those challenges or presents new ones.
Well, I guess I'll react to that, Tom. Bill Acker again, New York Best. I think this is certainly a really good step in the right direction. I'm not nearly as concerned as you are about this overestimating in 2045 and 2050, because I think it's important to recognize that all the other scenarios flatline after 2040, which is a weird assumption. The fact that we're going to build in 2040, we're going to totally stop building DGs for at that point forevermore. It really, I suspect that those actually are not high at all. So I think you're quite reasonable in this assumption. I'd also add that, you're going to have a fair amount of DG distributed energy storage in addition to distributed solar. So once you start adding the two of those together, I'd be very comfortable with reaching those numbers.
That's an excellent point, Bill. And carrying from our last conversation, I remember one of the things that maybe less formally, because it has to be done in a more nuanced manner, we wanted to consider for this scenario specifically was a paradigm where DER is more flexible and better able to meet certainly local grid needs, if not even larger scale grid needs. And a big part of that would be integrated with storage, which is where we see most of our distributed solar and storage coming in today. So good note, and I think one that we'll heed as we move forward. Any other thoughts on this before I move to the load forecast? Okay. I can't see hands, so jump in if you have hands up, but otherwise I'll keep moving.
Good.
Excellent. So on the load forecast, one of the challenges that we got in the previous session was that, some of the characteristics look right, but some of the other ones, for example, winter load, aren't differentiated properly, and good, fair challenges, especially as winter loading might be defining in the later years. So one of the places we wanted to look for another case that could work is go back to the CAC work that's the scoping plan type work that's been done, because that's a source of a lot of these scenarios. And one of the places we started was the 2023 annex that NYSERDA updated for the CAC cases, and specifically the 2023, I'll call it forecast, maybe policy forecast, which has some of these case details. Again, you don't have to take notes. This will all be in what's sent out, but at a high level, what's considered in that forecast, and it's actually changed quite a bit from previous years, and will probably work well as a lower loading scenario, we think. So I added them down here at the bottom with these tables, and you can see the forecast in orange. Importantly, flagged to the wrong one. That's here. Importantly, it reduces statewide loading, and really the factor that we were all looking at last time that was, again, a good challenge was winter loading. This scenario does a lot less winter load growth through, it mitigates some of it. It assumes some of the loading is going elsewhere. I think it has some assumption around adoption of hydrogen vehicles, particularly in the medium and heavy duty, as opposed to electric vehicles, and some other considerations around how quickly heating is electrified and what technologies it utilizes that made a lot of these changes. But I think this rectifies some of the concerns, particularly that were brought up around winter loading. So this, in combination with the DER forecast, should do a very good job of differentiating it from a load and generation standpoint compared to the other cases. I'll pause again. Thoughts, comments, and again, this is all public information. That's another intentional thing we did here. So, you know, if you really want to get under the hood and understand what the generation mix is and what the load assumptions that led to this are, if you go to the NYSERDA webpage with the updates to the Climate Action Council scoping work, that we can include a link when I send this out. I'll include a link. You can really dig in on detail on all the specifications they have, but this is the resulting load forecast.
So Tom, I'm Bill Acker again. I'm just trying to understand. This scenario now has about 50% increase in DG or DERs. But it sounds like the impact on load is being derived from some other changes, not the 50% increase in DERs. And you mentioned changes to assumptions in heating, electrification, and vehicles. How is the DER part modifying the load in this?
That's a great question, and something I should have clarified from the start. Is these are that the DER and load forecasts are unique. So the way that they'd be implemented is in kind. The load forecasts would be modeled at each node, and then we'd essentially model the DER as either a generator or more likely a negative load. But the effect will be a reduction in net load at those lower level buses that are rolled up. You're not seeing that effect here. This is still distinguishing the two. So this is a load forecast that needs to be aligned with the solar forecast such that it would probably come down even further, particularly during times when solar is going to be high outputting or solar plus storage is going to be high outputting. So good question. The planners would have to go back through, and particularly at the stage where they go from zonal to nodal, line up all of these forecasts and effectively add them up in a way that they're going to cancel out in some places.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Good question. No, and we didn't want to just levelize it, because particularly upstate, as you know, the solar is going to be much lumpier than the load, and we want to make sure to have that ability to place it where we think it's going to go, as opposed to just one for one with load everywhere. So good question.
Yeah, I'm trying to connect the dots on a couple of things here, so I'm going to ask some of my colleagues to jump in if needed. But my understanding is that this load forecast has some different policies in it, but it doesn't have, its core or its bottom-up set of assumptions didn't match achievement of CLCPA.
I believe that this still represents achievement of the explicit CLCPA requirements, and you can see some of them listed here, right? Like, for example,
I'm going to ask
the
Nick to
CEF
jump
stuff.
in.
Yeah,
Please.
I'm at there on the nice trying to reconcile. That
We can't hear the speaker.
Yeah, sorry, Nick, you're cutting in and out.
no, sorry, I've got a new headset. Can you hear me better now, or not really?
Yep, that was better.
Okay. So I was just noting that there's a couple of workbooks on the NYSERDA GHG study page. I just wanted to be sure which one you're pulling from. So we had a revised version of the CAC workbook that had a new scenario 2 and scenario 3, but we also published a 2023 standalone reference case. And that case added some new policies that weren't in place at the time we did the original CAC modeling. So there was some, for example, additional transportation policies that were incorporated. And for example, the new construction mandate that came out of the budget process last year for buildings was also included, but it doesn't achieve the economy-wide emission limit. So I wasn't sure if you were pulling the reference 2023 workbook, in which case, as Dave noted, that's not a economy-wide emission limit compliant case.
I'll have to double check which link. It's the one that I was formerly working on the 2022 annex, and it was the one that appeared right below that said 2023 annex. But I'll follow up with you in terms of, I'll like send some screenshots, circle what I clicked, and make sure that it's the right thing. If it's not, update it here.
Okay, yeah, because there wasn't a significant increase in the reference case compared to what was published for the Climate Action Council materials from adding those new policies in. But if it is the reference 23, it's not compliant from an economy-wide emission limit perspective.
Yeah, which would be a problem for us. Okay. Well, so with that caveat, that I need to go and make sure, I'll work with NYSERDA to make sure this is the right of those cases, i.e. it's one of the scenarios updated from 2020 that is compliant, not a non-compliant scenario that's something different. Otherwise, any other questions, comments, thoughts? Thank you, NYSERDA, for joining in and clarifying.
This is Chi from NISO, and Tom, thank you for walking through so that we have, with this clarity, we're able to identify whether the forecast is the right one to use or not. So thank you. I think that's a really good catch. I guess my question mainly, perhaps not for you, but more for NYSERDA. Will a forecast like this for policy achievement be available in the future? I suppose when I'm looking at these assumptions, I'm not only looking at how we can complete the cycle, but also all the other cycles going forward. Can what we do right now be replicated in the future cycles? So we have a forecast we can go by this time because NYSERDA is updating the forecast. So would the next cycle would still continue to have this forecast? Again, this is not urgent question naturally. This is more of I think for us to think through what we do, something that we can replicate in the future. Thanks.
Sorry, so the question is, will NYSERDA have updates to the load forecast as we're updating for future cycles of CGPP? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, that's part of the question. So that if we use the CSC forecast this time, is the next time we say, all right, this is a process we did last time, we can just do the same. Or there's some other changes we need to consider.
Yeah, so I think what happened with the reference case is a pretty good example of the kinds of ways that we tried to update the CAC modeling toolkit over time as we learn more and see new policies. We don't have a formal commitment to necessarily update our load every X years in the same way, for example, that the Gold Book comes out as a new version every year. But we are sort of looking internally at ways that we can continue to keep the forecast as accurate as possible. But definitely expect to see things like the reference case, which is policies on the books, to evolve more so than the mitigation cases, for example, that are already having to push pretty hard on adoption across mitigation measures to be able to hit the CLCPA emission limit. So it's that lower load reference case that I would expect to move more drastically. But we are looking at ways of trying to keep our analytic tools as accurate as possible for what we know.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
I'll also add to that conversation, just in the interest of transparency, is that I think as part of this first cycle, we're identifying how important having expertise around our forecasts, both load and generation, are, because they're going to set the tone for the rest of the analysis and not something we can really change as we uncover lessons through the analysis. So I know as we have some reports due in the summer that are going to describe ways that potentially in future cycles or even in the current cycle, we can make things run a little smoother. And I know, having additional forecasting resources and expertise is to ensure consistency and transparency is one of the things that we're thinking about on our end too. So good note, Chi.
This is Raya Salter. That's very helpful. I joined the meeting a little bit late, but I absolutely, I'm just, looking at the screen and what some of these case details are, these policy details and any changes that would have come up. Like, I'm just very interested in seeing that, and please follow up. I know you will when you identify if this is the CLCPA compliant case or not. And just to that point that was brought up of, there's a lot of policy changes that are happening, and how do we make sure that we keep track of those with transparency I think is extremely important. So just really just wanting to be sensitive to wanting to see as much information as possible, and making sure that we're, especially on the policy front, that we're sort of lining up between all of the scenarios. So that's, I guess, more of a comment than anything.
Good. I think that's a good comment, and something we're starting to recognize is having consistency through this requires a good bit of expertise and certainly a lot of elbow grease. So
Yeah.
something we've got our eyes on for certainly through this cycle and certainly the next cycle.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so I put that information in the chat, so maybe I'll follow up with the folks from NYSERDA after this or early tomorrow to run this to ground and make sure we're all on the same page. And I know we mentioned we'll at least loop NYSERDA into any conversations with the ISO when we have to translate these things that are words on a page into numbers in a model. And I'm sure even more questions will come up at that point. But maybe to keep things moving, I'll hand this over to some of my colleagues who are a little more technically savvy than me, and they're going to describe what we've done here around DFIRS to meet some of the questions brought up and suggestions that either EPPAC or Skylar or both have suggested here. So
Yep.
I'll pause and hand off. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, so in terms of DFIRS, so for scenario 2, the low transmission one, we plan to use the same DFIR assumptions as the state scenario to facilitate comparison between the cases. But then for scenario 3, the high transmission one, we are planning on representing DFIRS as fuel cells. This provides 2 main benefits. The first is that the fuel cells avoid combustion and the associated emissions with that, and it simplifies the accounting around, is it in a DAC community, is it not in a DAC community? The other reason is this committee was interested in looking at a minimum DFIR type scenario, and using the fuel cell, which has a higher cost than your turbine type technologies, effectively is probing that sort of minimum DFIR type scenario. I will note that DFIR build out is not particularly sensitive to cost, so it may not have that much of an effect, but it's at least probing in that particular direction. And then in terms of some of the details to underlie that, for the fuel cells, there are 3 main questions that come up. The first is what price set to use. And luckily for us, the CAC integration analysis does have numbers for fuel cells that even breaks it down by zone within NYSO. And we do plan to use these numbers. Specifically, in that particular tab, it's the resource cost mid and the thermal op care tabs, in case you want to look those up. Another question that comes up as well is how much firm capacity do these resources provide? It's sort of like ELCC or UCAP, if you're familiar with the terms. We plan on using the same numbers as the turbine-based DFIRS in the other cases. We don't have a better number for fuel cells than that. And then the last question that came up as well is, will this fuel cell DFIR definition apply to all DFIRs? And our plan at present is yes, because it avoids the detailed subzonal accounting around what resources are in disadvantaged communities, as well as which ones are not, as well as which existing fossil units will choose to upgrade to running hydrogen. We don't necessarily know that. We don't necessarily want to weigh in on that. Assuming they're all the fuel cells, sort of alleviates those concerns, at least in terms of the zonal model that we're working on right now. And I'll also note that sort of putting cost aside for a minute, the purpose of building DFIRS is to meet the capacity needs of the system. And the build out is not going to change that much, whether it's a fuel cell or it's a turbine-based DFIR. It's going to build what it needs to build to hit the capacity that it needs. And the ultimate goal of this study is to identify transmission needs, not the specific DFIRs themselves. They're mainly just a proxy unit here. So I said a lot of things, and I'm happy to take questions or get input from the committee on this.
Radha Surya from Invenergy, representing IPNI. I do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first question I have is when you introduce fuel cells, these are the other technologies you're considering under the DFIRS, right? These are the fuel technologies you assume will be coming online during the time frame for
meeting the CGPP goals. So those are the technologies that are being considered.
Correct. Yeah. So scenario 2 would be your typical turbine type technologies, and your scenario 3, the high transmission one, we are assuming it would be a fuel cell to sort of probe the higher capital cost space. So yeah, each one has sort of one assumption to it. It's not necessarily having the option to build all of the above, because then you have to put a bunch of constraints around it can't build turbines in disadvantaged communities and a whole lot of other things that may be difficult to model in a zonal level model.
Okay. The next question I have is, in the model, looks like we are restricting these to the existing sites. One of the requests from EPPAC is that these generators should not be restricted to these sites and there should be other locations to be considered. Are there any other places that DFOs might play a better role?
Yeah, I would say in terms of restricting the sites, that's one of the considerations when we were still thinking the turbine type combustion technologies. When we added this fuel cell, because it doesn't have emissions, you don't necessarily need to restrict where it's built as much. I mean, there may be land use limitations in the New York City area, but at least for this, I think we're not implementing a hard limit on the DFR build.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
I think Julie has a question.
I do. Thank you. So first of all, I'm not sure if they're intending to share a screen. I can't see the screen anymore, but I did see it. So anyway, I recognize now, turning to a system that does not have a combustion, the benefit of that on air quality, but I'm wondering if there are other considerations that we may want to keep like limitation of these sites in DACs, for example, like depending on what the fuel is, if there's additional trucking or pipeline build-outs and any other like issues that might affect disadvantaged communities that would still benefit limiting the build-out in these areas. And if folks have thought about that, I don't know if I have like listed in my head exactly what those are at this point, but I could think a bit more about it with our team at the city.
Yeah, I definitely think it'd be certainly interesting to dig a little bit more on that. My impression would be that it would be hydrogen-fueled fuel cells, and they would likely run through pipelines. So not as much trucking, the emissions would be clean, but you might have to redo some of the pipelines to handle the hydrogen. I see Raya has a question.
Sorry, I took my hand down. Thank you.
No worries.
I think Bill has a hand up.
Sure.
Yep. Just one more question on this. I think a general question is where the hydrogen comes from from a load perspective, and I believe in the state scenarios they were assuming 50% of the hydrogen was generated in state through electrolysis. So the question is, are we building that into the load? Is that already in the assumption? What is your assumption for the generation of the hydrogen?
Yeah, I'm happy to defer that to NICE if they want to comment specifically on it. But yeah, you would need to have electrolysis likely upstate to handle that. It would be non-coincident with the peak type operation, so it's not going to affect that. But it is a significant amount of energy to generate that hydrogen, as well as with the CAC, you could import half of it if that's available.
Yeah, I think that was already built into some of the state assumption pieces, and clearly it makes sense and it wouldn't be on peak. I agree with that. And so, I mean, it's a scenario we like, but I want to make sure we've built it in properly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I know that the cases have varying levels of electrolysis load commensurate with the standard that you mentioned, the 50% in-state development. But I'll add that to the list of things to make sure of when we go back and double check some of these CAC forecasts.
Great, thanks, Tom.
I see Raya has a question.
Yeah, I put my hand back up because I understand, why this is being done, and it makes a ton of sense, and it just sort of invites, as the previous discussion illuminated, like more kind of questions about exactly what, how, and where is being represented. And I guess if A, I think transparency there is going to be important, and B, like, what is the latest and greatest in terms of tracking what's going on here? Is this this present document that's being presented today that's going to be circulated, or, how can I keep track of this going forward?
I think that's probably a Tom question, but I assume we're going to finalize the assumptions in the matrix that you saw, and then that can be provided. But I don't know if Tom wants to comment.
Yeah, I think that's the plan. Is we'll share this sheet with Skylar, who will share it with everyone else, and then Skylar had the right idea. I think is once these are finalized and NYSO's begun work and incorporating them into their capacity expansion models, there'll be something more official to put together to potentially post on the DMM site. I don't know, Skylar, if that's where you were going with that.
Yeah, that's exactly the plan. We have these working papers that we'll be sending out after each meeting, and then there'll be a final scenario matrix posted as well, just like there was for the first scenario.
All right, thank you.
Don't see any other questions. Yep. If not, I appreciate all the comments you've had.
Sorry, Rodiga here. I do have a question on the DER forecast that you showed earlier. And the question is, if you have an estimate of the distribution investments that are required to integrate those amounts of DERs, or is that part of the plan to look at that as well? And the comment is from the perspective that this is a transmission and process that is supposed to optimize between distribution and local transmission. And if we do too much DER, does it mean we are also accounting for distribution investments required for those type of that type of integration of DER?
Very good question with a slightly complicated answer. But part of the reason that even when we saw these initial, the 2045 and 2050 numbers, we had to take pause related to the answer. So you're right that this is an integrated T&D plan. Obviously, most of the planning focus is going to be on the transmission side, just because of the scale and expertise on the distribution side isn't lined up with what we're doing here. But the plan is to utilize our distribution planning expertise through the existing distribution planning processes. So an easy example is cost share 2.0, where if we are seeing a forecast, right? So for example, at National Grid, Jeff Marr would be looking at the zonal forecast and trying to disaggregate it into a nodal forecast. And a big part of that is going to be siting this distributed solar that's quite chunky. And he might put it on a distribution station that currently has 20 MVA of distribution capacity. But let's say he wants to allocate 40 megawatts of solar there because that's what's needed for this forecast. The only way we'd be able to do that, to your point, is if the bank were upsized. The only way that Jeff would feel confident in doing that without doing a detailed, interconnection and study at the distribution level would be to review our cost share 2.0 measures. And if, for example, we had forecasted 40 megawatts of solar here and accordingly established a cost share 2.0 option for distributed solar developers to upsize this bank on a cost shared basis to meet that reverse power flow need of 40 megawatts versus 20 megawatts, then that would be something we could consider and incorporate here and sort of, if you will, steal from the work that distribution planning has already done that's probably more detailed than what we would have done otherwise. That's a simple example. Obviously, there's going to be lots of exceptions and hooks in places where we need to use some discretion in the middle. But I do imagine that we're going to put some thought on the existing distribution assets when allocating and avoid allocating distributed generation that far exceeds what obviously can be supported on the existing distribution system. And if we're going to consider upgrades to the distribution system, I think that would be done in limited cases and in alignment with where distribution planning has already identified that upgrade, for example, in a capital investment plan or a cost share 2.0. And caveat all of that with the fact that there's very many nodes to work on here. So the amount of detail that each planner is going to be able to put towards each node on the distribution side is going to probably be limited. But that's the guiding, spirit, if you will, for the way that we're thinking of implementing this, leveraging our existing forecasts and distribution planning plans, so that we can sort of do some distribution planning without extending this 3-year process to a 7-year process. So I'll pause for any planners on the phone who want to correct anything I just said, because that was very high level, and I gave some examples that we haven't all talked through at the JU. And if not, I'll hand it back to EPPAC for questions or thoughts on that. Okay, no challenges. So hopefully that's close enough. It's pretty close to what we're planning to do as a JU, and hopefully that answers your question on how we'll consider distribution side limits and potentially costs.
That was very helpful. Thank you, Tom. Just trying to restate what you said. You will be looking at optimizing the DER and making the case when upgrades are required. I'm just thinking from a total distribution investment cost. If this will mean you will add those up. And what I'm trying to get at is if DER is to replace, I believe that's part of the thinking, is to replace some of the large scale renewables. I think the distribution investment cost should be factored into such that we don't underestimate what the total cost will be, whether local or distribution of the portfolio. As opposed to saying we don't replace large scale renewables with DER, but we still have to make some local investments.
I think that's a fair challenge. I think we're envisioning doing this in a way that we try and utilize existing distribution plans so that we can reference existing plans and costs and sort of not have to redevelop them here as an incremental effort. But that said, if the scenario is driving much more distribution need than is currently planned for under any planning forecasts or considerations, which is possible under this extreme scenario, then I think we would have to get a little creative and make sure that, at least in our reporting, we're reflecting the fact that there's a basic assumption that led to that distribution cost or potentially some gaps so that we're being fully transparent.
And maybe that could also put into question, or whatever amount was supposed to replace large scale renewables may not be the same amount. Maybe that can be part of the questioning as well once you get into the details. Because if we cannot replace DER, we cannot replace large scale renewables with DER for less cost than from the transmission standpoint, then maybe it wouldn't make sense to replace large scale renewables with DER.
No, this is a good challenge. That's definitely going to affect us when we go from zonal to nodal in the summer and fall, and something we'll note here to consider, particularly for this low case now that we're moving to a much higher DER penetration that's going to offset the need for some LSR potentially, and we'll have to be very nuanced in the way we approach that and the value of that, to your point, to not misrepresent the value of DER in the filing relative to LSR. We'll have to be very careful.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions, or challenges on what we've discussed? Excellent. I really appreciate folks doing some critical thinking on this, especially on the fly. I'll in short order coordinate with our friends at NYSERDA here and make sure that everything makes sense. And if we change anything, we'll be really careful to document that when we send out this copy to Skylar. But hopefully I can put a bow on this in the next day or two and get it out to all of you for review. And I put the website in the chat here, the one that I was referencing earlier in terms of more details. And again, if we change anything in terms of which of those links we utilize, we'll make sure to be really clear in the next day or two when we share this with Skylar so that he can share it with all of you. Otherwise, thank you, and I'll hand it back to Skylar.
Sounds good. That was the primary piece we had on the agenda today. We do have obviously a bit of time left if there's questions that folks have about the process or timing or future EPPAC meetings. But as I said at the beginning, we do still plan to have meetings every 2 weeks. They're not posted yet, but we do have those still coming up. And I see Liz came on camera.
Hi, Skylar. Hi, everybody. Where are we with, we were gonna hand around an updated process chart. Where are we with that?
Under development was the last update I got about a week ago from Mark Cottrell.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I think
That's in your shop,
we're
right?
near.
Okay.
I think we're near final on that. We were just talking about it the other day on a joint utilities call. Don't quote me, but I know we were just going through the last couple pieces and implementing them.
Thank you.
Yep, and it sounds like it's probably going to be combination flow chart and bringing some things in from the filing. Everybody has the timeline and sequencing all in one place with a little bit of the extra detail that stakeholders had requested, like the data and the handoffs and what modeling tools and stuff like that. Okay. So I guess we'll be ending this meeting early. As always, the EPPAC email address is open 24/7 if anybody has any questions. And we will ask that stakeholders continue to kind of coordinate via email if there's additional questions for us or for the JU about the scenarios that pop up after this. Please don't hesitate to reach out and shoot over an email. We'll try to coordinate there too in the next couple weeks. We'll be sending around, as Tom said, details from this meeting and any other information about the matrix or the timeline as we get it. But I think at this point we'll adjourn and send out a meeting invite for 2 weeks from now. So thanks everybody for joining and have a great week.
Thanks all.